Class, welcome to the final lecture of our 6-week history course of world history. 1945 to the present. So we're going to finish off with various wars in the Persian Gulf, and this is going to get a little dicey and a little tricky compared to our previous lecture, but I think you'll enjoy the complicated aspects of this war, or these wars, and the relationships between these countries: Iran, Iraq, the United States, Kuwait, and various other secondary and tertiary players as well. So let's pick up where we left off. And notice, before we continue on, notice the 1980 to question mark, because one could still argue that the big wars of the Persian Gulf really began in the early 1980s, and they've pretty much continued all the way to the present day, with some time in the 1990s very little happening. But apart from those 8 years in the 1990s where nothing was going on, 8 or 9, let's say 10 years. So let's say 10 years, close to 10 years. The majority of this time, they're always in some sort of war, whether it's throughout the 1980s or in the 2000s and the ongoing war that we have now. So the Persian Gulf has been full of wars and continues to be full of wars, involving various different players from the Iranians to the Iraqis to the Americans. And that takes us to perhaps the most famous country in all of the Middle East, Iraq. Perhaps even more famous than Saudi Arabia, and maybe even more famous than Israel. Because all of us have grown up hearing about Iraq. I was born in 1986, so I grew up my entire life hearing about the Gulf War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the evil of Saddam Hussein, even when he wasn't doing much in the middle of the 90s. Eventually the war in Iraq in 2003, and then it's still going on. The war is still going on to this day. Now, some of you who are younger may not have heard as much about them as maybe me, because we've kind of done what we always do after we've been in a place for a while, kind of ignore it and move on. And now we're hearing more about Syria than we are Iraq. But Iraq really was the Middle Eastern country at one time. When you asked any American to name a country in the Middle East, they would probably name Iraq. That was the country that they named, because it was the one that they knew, because they heard about it so much. So Iraq is a neighbor to Iran. Iran's to the right. Iraq is right in the center there, and you can see Syria just off to the northwest. There's Jordan to the southeast, and Israel's not too far away. Kuwait is that very, very little country right down here, right on the Persian Gulf. And this large monstrosity right here we can't see the name of is Saudi Arabia. Iraq is the bitter rival of Iran for a number of reasons. And it proves to be a power player in the Middle East until eventually it's toppled. Now, there's a lot of complicated, intricate web of relationships between Iraq and various other countries. And it's one of the reasons why Americans get involved in the first place. That is a picture of Agrabah from Aladdin, and I did that partially out as a joke and partially to make a point. The movie Aladdin, the original 1992 release of Aladdin, took place in the fictional town of Agrabah. And Agrabah essentially is Baghdad, and Baghdad is the capital of Iraq. So all of that takes place in Iraq. It is a very old and ancient country in its own right. It is considered the birthplace of Western civilization, the cradle of civilization. The two great rivers in central Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates, are considered the cradle of Western civilization, and the founding of three major Western civilizations, collectively known as the Mesopotamian people, but these would be the Assyrians, the Sumerians, and the Babylonians. Iraq is a Middle Eastern country, whereas Iran considers itself Persian. It doesn't consider itself Arab or Middle Eastern. It considers itself Persian. Iraq considers itself Middle Eastern. Its dominant language is going to be Arabic, and it's going to consider itself because of that. It's an Arab country. Iran, the people of Iran ethnically are Arab. and are not terribly different from the people in Iraq or Saudi Arabia. But because they speak Farsi, which is referred to as Persian, and they have this very proud imperial past with the various Persian empires in their incarnations, Iran considers itself Persian, and they speak Persian. Iraq considers itself Middle Eastern and Arab, and they speak Arabic. And so there's a cultural distinction between these two regions, despite the fact that they are so close by, as you can see here. Notice the religion, much more diverse than Iran. Iran was 90% Sunni, about 10 or 15% Shia, with a very, very small Christian minority. Iraq certainly has a small Christian and Jewish minority, but only 20% of its population is Sunni and 70% of its population is Shia. And I want you to remember those numbers. The majority of the population of Iraq is Shia. Now, this is only 70%, whereas Iran is 90% or almost 95%. But the Sunnis are going to make up a very large and vocal minority in Iraq and play a very large role in Iraq's culture as we move forward. But make no mistake about it, the majority of Iraq's population is Shia, and the Shia dominate Iran. So note those connections in your notes. We're not going to get into the long, illustrious history of Iraq as a great kingdom because it would just take us back too long. Modern Iraq is formed in 1920 as a kingdom and more or less exists until 1968 before it's replaced as a republic. 1958 as a republic and then as an Arab republic in 1968. That gets confusing. I'll explain it in the next slide. So modern Iraq is established in 1920 as what is called a British mandate. Now, what the heck is a mandate? It's not quite a colony and it's not quite a protectorate. It's sort of a made-up thing on the fly for the British and the French to control the Middle East after World War I. So all of this land, Saudi Arabia, parts of Iran, Iraq, Palestine, Oman, what is now Jordan, and Turkey are all under control of the Turks. And the Turks are known as the Ottoman Empire. And after the Ottoman Empire is defeated during World War I, the British claim control over these lands just south of Turkey. They leave Turkey to the Turks, although they actually try to divide that up too, but they fail. But they leave Turkey mainly to the Turks, and they take all of this land, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and they claim it for themselves, and they divvy it up between different European powers in what is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There's actually several agreements between the British and European powers and the Arabs on the ground who are working with them to fight the Ottoman Turks, who they don't want to be under anymore. But the British and the French go off and strike their own deals, and they more or less leave these other people behind. Iran is made into a kingdom that operates more or less autonomously, but they're very joined to the British. The British create the British Mandate of Iraq, which turns into a kingdom in its own right, and the British mandates of Palestine and Jordan. And you can see how brilliant the British are here. They have essentially all of this land under their control, even though there's a kingdom of Jordan and there's a colony of Palestine controlled by Jewish Zionists, and there's a kingdom of Iraq and there's a kingdom of Iran, which is more autonomous. The British pretty much have all of and this is why it was drawn this way. These look like bizarre puzzle pieces. The reason why this is drawn this way is so the British can drive their trucks and have railroads all the way through Iraq and Iran to lay claim to the oil in Iran and Iraq. That's the only reason why this is done this way. These borders were drawn as artificially as possible. They were not drawn for any sense of culture, tribal lineage, any sense of what would have been right and proper at this time. They were drawn specifically to please people in London and Paris, not people living on the ground. The French got Syria, and the French got Lebanon. The British get Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and they have a strong relationship with Iran. And while it's not listed here, the Italians claim the lower part of Turkey. This was not done with any of the local people and their input. They were simply left out of the negotiations. As a factoid, I just want to point out one thing. The British could have actually claimed Saudi Arabia as well in their own right, but they chose not to, and they turned that into an Arab nation. The Arabs originally wanted all of this, with their capital traditionally going to be in Damascus, which was the traditional capital of the Arab world. But the French wanted Damascus because there is timber, cedar trees, trade routes, minerals, and wealth there. And they want Lebanon as well because of the missionary service. And the British don't want to give up this land here because of the rich oil fields. And so the British and the French give the Arab people, despite the fact that the Arabs are very upset about this, they give them the Arabian Peninsula, which is mostly worthless desert. At least it's worthless desert until the 1920s when oil is discovered, or the late 1920s when oil is discovered. So the joke was actually on the British. They could have been sitting on a gold mine, but they chose to give this as a token piece of land to the Saudis, and by the time they realized how much wealth was in this land, the Saudis had complete control over it. So hindsight's 2020, the joke was on them. The Kingdom of Iraq exists throughout the 1930s and continues into the 1950s, but unfortunately a lot of civil unrest occurs. The British Mandate really relinquishes most of its control by the 1930s, giving more and more control of these semi-British colonial lands over to the Iraqi kingdom, which will last for until 1958, where it becomes a republic. And they're going to do what Iran and Afghanistan had done, and no need to repeat over and over again. Semi-secular reforms, looking for partial secularization and socialization of the economy, but at the same time, Islam is very important, therefore they're not going to become Muslim, so on and so forth, the same as Algeria, the same as Iran, the same as Afghanistan. It's going to be the same as most of these countries, including Egypt, the ones I'm not really getting into. When the Iraqi Republic is founded in 1958, they overthrow the monarchy and they establish a republic that is very similar more towards a communist society than a socialist republic. It is a socialist People's Republic of Iraq, but very similar to very similar to the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which was the kind of the puppet state of the Soviet Union, and these various other Soviet-style communist societies. They're going to have a single party as opposed to multi-party. And that's a major difference here. So one party's in control. Same with China. If you're not in the party, you can't really do anything. You are a second-class citizen. They're going to gravitate towards socialism, but they are not communist and Marxist themselves. They are looking mainly to create a military-style government rooted in socialism and a single-party system. And they're not going to advocate socialism, and they're not going to advocate Islamic nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism. They're instead going to advocate for pan-Arab nationalism. This is very, very different from what was going on in Iran and what was going on in Afghanistan. Pan-Arab nationalism, the idea that all Arab peoples of the world, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, the Palestinians over in Palestine, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, all those people, any of the Arabs that might be living in Iran, were destined to one day be united under one single government, and that this government would flex its arms and control its destiny. That was the idea. The man that's going to see himself as the future king and president of this pan-Arab republic comes to power in 1968, and this is Saddam Hussein. So after the Israelis win the Six-Day War in 1967, I know I don't talk about that, but it is a very important war. The Israelis are able to really put the Palestinian people under their thumb after the Six-Day War. Very radical socialists in Iraq take control of the republic, thinking it too weak, and they overthrow the existing government, and they form a new government called the Iraqi Republic. So you had the Republic of Iraq in 1958 to 1968, and the Iraqi Republic 1968 until 2003. Now, it's not any more socialist or leftist than the previous government. It's the exact same people. They just get rid of the old leaders and replace them with new leaders and then change the name. But their politics are pretty much the same. Economic socialism, pan-Arabism, well, that's pretty much it. The party that's going to come to control the Iraqi Republic from 1968 onward is called the Ba'athist Party. So the Ba'athist Party is going to overthrow the Socialist Republic of Iraq to form the Iraqi Republic, which also leans socialist. I know this is confusing, but just go with it. It's more of a name change than anything else. And the older leaders from 1958 to 1968 are going to be ousted and replaced by Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist Party. And they're pretty much, though, going to continue the policies of the previous government, but with a stronger fist. They're going to be secular. They're going to lean socialist. They're not going to be Marxist and communist, though. And they're going to be pan-Arab nationalism. And Saddam Hussein sees himself as a future king or president of this pan-Arab national kingdom. Not to pay a compliment to the Soviet Union and even communist China after Mao was deposed and you had the pragmatists, whereas China and the Soviet Union certainly tried to, and to a certain extent, these sort of semi-socialist republics of Iran and Afghanistan, there was an emphasis on redistribution of wealth to the poor. They wanted to modernize infrastructure, modernize their militaries, modernize their governments, but there was an emphasis on, and Mossadegh really, although he wasn't a communist, he was definitely a socialist-leaning individual. There was an attempt to feed the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the poor, redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the poor, create a more equitable society, similar to what you would find in Western Europe. The Iraqi government, more so than its predecessor, the Republic of Iraq. The Republic of Iraq is going to be somewhat socialistic. The Iraqi Republic under Saddam Hussein is still going to continue secular and semi-socialist government styles, but they are mostly what I would like to call quasi-socialist. They are not really interested in redistributing money to the poor. Instead, all of the money they take is going to go directly into the military. So this is going to become a military government. Modern roads, railroads, and most people who have any money whatsoever are members of the Iraqi government or the Iraqi military. I want to point out to you, we think of this Middle Eastern world, this Arab world, as just a bunch of Muslim people. But it's a very complicated world. Saddam Hussein, for example, is Muslim himself, but he is not really a practitioner. He could possibly be an atheist. I don't know if he was an atheist or not, but he was culturally a Muslim, not religiously. And he was interested in a secular state. Mossadegh in Iran was interested in a secular state, although Mossadegh was still a practitioner of Islam. So he advocates a secular state. He does not want to do what the Taliban are going to try to do in Afghanistan, or what Al-Qaeda are doing, or what the Iranians want to do, these large Islamic empires. He wants an Arab empire. So that doesn't matter if the Arabs are Jews, because there are Jewish Arabs. There are Jews that live in Iraq who are Arab ethnically and work in the Iraqi government. There are Christians who work in the Iraqi government. There are Christian Palestinians. There are Christian Syrians. Remember, this is the Middle East. It's the heart of the Jewish Christian, and Muslim world. It is where all of these religions began. So there are tons of people in these areas that they're called Semitic people. They are Arabs. They are Jews. Not the European Jews, not the European Christians. Semitic people specifically from the Middle East. They look Middle Eastern. And Saddam Hussein sees all of these people who have Arab lineages and roots coming together and forming an Arab government. Now, a lot of them are going to be Muslim, but the purpose of this government is not going to be Islamic. It's going to be secular. It's supposed to be a powerful government like the Soviet Union, a powerful semi-socialistic government that prides itself on Islamic culture and traditions, on Arab cultures and traditions, whether they are Jewish or Christian. the greatness of the Arab people, period, end of story. And the Ba'ath Power party is going to be a secular party dominated by Muslims, but also has Christians and Jews as well. So we really have to understand this in its context. There's a wonderful picture of Saddam shooting a gun up in the air. He used to do this crap all the time when I was growing up. I mean, there was not a day that went by there wasn't some video of him shooting guns up in the air like this. He really prided himself on this. And remember, I pointed out that that Stalin was sort of the model of Saddam. And you can see that here. He looks like Joseph Stalin. The mustache, the style of dress, the way he carried himself. Saddam Hussein takes full control as a dictator of Iraq, the Iraqi Republic in 1979, and he's going to continue to evolve and develop this modern Iraqi government under his thumb. And he's going to have good points and bad points. So if we ignored this last point down here, just pretend this doesn't exist. He takes control in Iraq, and under his leadership, he promotes free compulsory education, K through 12, and universal education in the Iraqi universities. He improves public medical care and access to medical care. The average lifespan of an Iraqi increases tenfold when he takes over. He provides universal medical care to his people. He improves modern infrastructure and creates dams to create electrical power plants to bring lighting all throughout the country, at least to most parts of it. He extends rights to women. Women don't have to cover themselves under Saddam Hussein. Some of them do, but they don't have to by Islamic law. Most of them go to school as well and receive education and can own property. He forms an alliance with the Soviet Union, but they're nearby, and they're going to support him with a lot of weapons and stuff to create this pan-Arab society that he's looking forward to. So as a whole, he looks like a great reformer for his people, similar to Mossadegh, maybe a little more militaristic and maybe more close to the Soviet Union. Mossadegh really was not close to the Soviet Union. He played both the Soviet Union and the Western powers. Saddam Hussein's more interested in keeping close contact tabs with the Soviet Union. But as a whole, he looks like a modern reformer, not terribly different from what we've seen in the past. However, now look at the bottom. He is cruel. He is authoritarian. He is paranoid and probably considered a psychopath, a madman. And he receives the nickname the Butcher of Baghdad. Because like Joseph Stalin, anybody he suspects conspiring against them are killed, removed from society. This includes family members, members of his inner circle, oppositional party members, oppositional members of his own party, anybody who's anybody. If he feels that they are crossing him, he removes them, he eliminates them. So he is paranoid, he is cruel, and he sends his soldiers into various cities from time to time to more or less bully the countryside, put people down, take money, and shoot and kill people on sight. Make no mistake about it, despite the fact that he sounds really good here, he is an authoritarian, ruthless dictator down here. He is a villain and a bad guy. This should not be forgotten. There's an old saying. There's an old saying in Indian culture that the friend of my enemy is the enemy of my friend, or something to that extent. I'm tired. I'm filming 5 of these in a row. You have to forgive me. You've heard this before. The friend of my enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There we go. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. There's an old saying that goes that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that goes true for Iraq, the United States, and Iran. So the Iranian Revolution happens in 1979. In 1980, the United States has not forgotten what had happened. The assault on American embassy officials, the toppling of a American-backed government that was headed by the Shah, who was friendly to American and British interests in Iran. The Americans never forgot that. The Americans also realized that the Iranian Revolution is an Islamic theocratic revolution. So in 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, Iran is transformed not from a secular monarchical constitutional republic that we saw before, but into a Islamic republic, one that's completely governed by Islamic law, and also begins to aid certain terrorist organizations as well on behalf of the Palestinian people. George H.W. Bush senses that there is a mutual alliance forming between Iraq and the United States. I pointed out before, Saddam Hussein may be a bad man. He might be an evil SOB, but he is secular, and while he has close ties to the Soviet Union, he's willing to sell his oil to the United States and to Great Britain. So Saddam Hussein really only seeks the Soviet Union out to help build his military, but on a whole, he plays both sides, East and West, as well. And he's willing to ally himself with the United States in 1980. Saddam Hussein is also deeply troubled by the Iranian Revolution. I pointed out the numbers before. The population of Iraq is 70% Shia and only 20% Sunni. Saddam Hussein is a Sunni, and he's not very religious. The majority of his country is Shia, and 95% of the population of Iran is Shia. And the dominant proponents of the Islamic Revolution, like the Ayatollah Khomeini, are Shia. So Saddam Hussein feels and fears that this Islamic revolution, this Iranian revolution, is going to spill over into Iraq from Iran, sweeping the 70% population of Iraq to the side of Iran, thereby overthrowing Saddam Hussein, overthrowing himself, thereby leading to the destruction of his growing pan-Arab society, and turning Iraq into a Islamic fundamentalist republic. Saddam does not want that. George W. Bush does, or H.W. Bush does not want that. Ronald Reagan does not want that. The Americans don't want that. The Americans want to pay Iran back for the problems they caused, and they also want to secure American interests in the region, specifically oil and listening posts in Iran, which they use to spy on the Soviet Union. And so George H.W. Bush, who was vice president of the United States at that time and was the former director of the CIA, offers Saddam Hussein personally economic aid and supplies and advisors to fight the Iranians. He does not provide military aid, but he provides a large amount of economic aid and non-essential military aid to Iraq, to the point where Saddam Hussein can essentially take all of his money and put it right into the military. And whatever money he's taking out of the system, the Americans are covering for him. So if he needs money to run the power plants, he takes all of that money out of running the power plants and puts them into the military, and the Americans just come in and pick up the check. And this is all done clandestinely. Nobody knows. This is not advertised in the newspapers. This is only known between the Iraqis and the American intelligence community. The Iraq War, the Iran-Iraq War, is what we could call a first Persian Gulf War. It is a major war between Iran and Iraq that lasts nearly a decade. And this is a gruesome war, even by 20th century war standards. Iraq invades Iran in 1980, and they're mainly looking to secure oil fields and secure trade routes and eventually hopefully overthrow or topple this Islamic Republic of Iran. Unlike a lot of wars that we've seen in the past in the 20th century, including many we don't talk about, whether it's Korea, Vietnam, the French-Vietnam War, the Algerian War, the revolution in China, the revolution in the Soviet Union, which happens before our period, the Iran-Iraq War is more gruesome than any other war of the 20th century, perhaps second only to World War I. Now, more people are going to die in World War II, but the tactics that are going to be used during the Iran-Iraq War are going to be similar to the tactics used in World War I. Machine gun nests, barbed wire, no man's land, intense artillery bombardment and barrages to the point where people begin to go crazy, large aerial battles similar to World War I and World War II, the use of mines, and the use of chemical weapons and poison gas on both military officials as well as civilians. And this was done by the Iraqi government against the Iranians. So the Iran-Iraq War looks a lot more like World War I, with some of the modern weaponry of World War II. Over the course of these 8 years, about 1.25 million people are killed. 500,000 of them are military people, and the rest are all civilians. And a point to note about the Iraqi chemical weapons, they get most of their chemical weapons from the French and the Americans. So we are not supplying military grade weaponry to the Iraqis directly, but we are the French are supplying chemical weapons to the Iraqis, and the Americans are helping to supply the French with chemical weapons as a whole. So a lot of these weapons are both French in construction and American. So if you were a soldier in Iraq, and I imagine some of you may be veterans, some of the weapons that you might find buried under the sand, which are chemical weapons, are not from the era of Saddam Hussein in the 1990s. They're actually were given to him by the French and, to a certain extent, the Americans. Needless to say, the Iranians are very, very pushed back by this. They are uncomfortable by it. They are shocked at how violent and brutal this warfare is. Here's a great picture of it. So despite the fact that Iran is gigantic compared to Iraq is very successful. They win numerous battles along the border, pushing further and further into Iran, attacking military bases, Iranian military bases, seizing oil fields, seizing river passageways and ports. And all of the red dots that you see here on this map are areas where the Iraqis have used chemical warfare against the Iranian people. The Iraqis also used chemical warfare against their own Iraqi people who were living in Shia villages who they feared would aid the Iranians. So this was very brutal warfare on behalf of the Iraqis against the Iranians and Shia Muslims as a whole. A bonus side quest is in store. Before we go on the bonus side quest, I want to tell you one quick thing about Iran. Iran does have a much larger, much more modern military, or maybe it's equal to modernity as the Iraq military, but it's larger. And they have one thing that the Iraqis don't have. They have an air force. They have a much, much better air force. Iran actually has Soviet-built MiGs and jets. And they are able to bomb Iraq. But most of those pilots and most of the military men who were trained to fight those planes were secular themselves and part of the Shah's government. And so a lot of them were either killed or left Iran. So the Islamic Republic, although there were military men in the Islamic Republic of Iran, they weren't ready for a war like this. And that's specifically why the war was started so early. The US and Iraq had hoped to catch the Iranians unprepared for a war, and they did. Now, the Iranians will eventually push back by the mid-1980s and unleash their jet warfare upon the Iraqis and harness more civilians and draft them into the military to fight against the Iraqis. So the Iraqis are not able to have their way with the Iranians and topple the entire government. But the early years of the war are dominated by the Iraqis, and their use of chemical warfare on civilians, both in Iran as well as Shia Muslims in Iraq, will never be forgotten by both sides. And that leads us to a bonus side quest. What use is studying history if we can't have a little fun, especially if that fun is somewhat dark and twisted, unfortunately? And this, unfortunately, is how America and the United States is going to get drawn further and further into this soap opera of Middle East politics. So the United States, as I pointed out before, was responsible for the coup in 1953, Operation Ajax, which deposed Prime Minister Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran, and replaced him with the autocratic Shah, who ruled Iran with an iron fist, backed by the United States, who trained most of his secret police. This angered a lot of people in Iran, which led to the Islamic Revolution. So while the Americans are backing the Iraqis to kind of get back at the Iranians for attacking their embassies in 1979 and kicking them out, there's a second sort of side quest here, another part of the Iran-Iraq war that's going on elsewhere that's going to lead in and feed into a scandal the likes of which rocks the Western world and really ruins the American reputation in terms of their ability to have clout in the Middle Eastern world, and this still affects us to this day. We are looking at pictures of South America, and as many of you know, South America has absolutely nothing to do with the Middle East. It, in fact, is not in the Middle East at all. On the right, or on the left, I should say, we are looking at Central America and South America and the greater Caribbean world. And on the right, we are specifically looking at Nicaragua, which is bordered by Honduras and Costa Rica. So it's right over here. This is Nicaragua right over here. Now, Nicaragua at this time had a leftist government. This leftist government was elected by the people in a majority election. And this angered the United States and concerned them because Latin America as a whole traditionally is considered the backyard of the United States. And the United States has a great interest in what goes on in places like Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, Aruba, Nicaragua, Honduras, Belize, Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. And the United States flexes its muscles here over the course of the 19th and 20th century. Unfortunately, I had to cut this lecture out of the 6 weeks, but to make a long story short, there are a lot of governments there was a government in Cuba before Castro overthrew it, but there was an American-backed government in the 1950s in Cuba that was dominated by American interests and American military supplies and strategies that was very brutal to the Cuban people. In addition, there were American-backed governments in Honduras, American-backed governments in Nicaragua, American-backed governments in Costa Rica, American-backed governments in Panama, American-backed governments in Colombia, Venezuela, and American-backed governments in Chile and Argentina. And most of these governments were very right-wing, very anti-democratic, and usually governed largely by military leaders. And they did unspeakable horrors to their own people. The reason why we were in favor of supporting these governments is because we did not want these governments to fall to socialism and communism. This happens in Argentina. This happens in Chile in particular, specifically under the Allende government, who was a Marxist leader who was elected by his own people in a democratically elected government, who eventually was overthrown by the American CIA and replaced with a anti-democratic dictator who killed many of his own people. I'm giving you the bare bones. In Nicaragua, something interesting happened. The American right-wing government of Nicaragua, the American-friendly military right-wing government of Nicaragua, was overthrown by a leftist government that was backed by the Soviet Union. And this made the United States very uncomfortable, and they wanted to get these people out of Nicaragua and replace this government with another American-friendly government. And this is what is called the Iran-Contra affair, which lasts a grand total of about 2 years, 1985 to 1987. Now, Nicaragua, the right-wing government of Nicaragua, which was a military government, was overthrown by the National Liberation Front. The National Liberation Front took its cues from a lot of what was going on in Iran, in Algeria, in places like that, and was a largely leftist socialist government. Now, they were not hardcore communists, although they did embrace elements of Marxism, but they were very much a leftist socialist government, and the Soviet Union was very quick to recognize them and start supporting them and supplying them, which made the United States very uncomfortable, both from the standpoint of strategic purposes, but also from the standpoint of being universally embarrassed that the Soviet Union, or that there was a democratically elected socialist government that came to power under their watchful eye. So this American junta was overthrown. A junta is a military government, overthrown in 1979, and the National Liberation Front came to power. But the United States opposed strenuously the NLF. And so they desperately wanted to give money and financial backing to a right-wing group of paramilitary leaders known as the Contras. And these are the Contras over here. The Contras were dominant in the hillside of Nicaragua. They were right-wing politically. They were also known to grow cocaine. And the Contras were people that Americans typically would not like, and nor would the American government typically want to ally themselves with. But the American government was interested in aligning with them and promoting them to power to overthrow this leftist government and reinstall some kind of military junta government that was friendly to the United States. Unfortunately, for the powers that be in the Reagan administration, there were people, both Republicans and Democrats, that did not want to support the Contras. The Contras were known to be very violent. They were terrorists. They kidnapped people. They killed them. They ransomed them. They made people disappear. They were terrorists. There's no other way to put it. They were thugs and they were terrorists. They were criminals. And nobody wanted to get involved with these people and have them overthrow another government. They would hope to simply try to negotiate with the Nicaraguan government to try and form some common ground. But there were still interests within the Reagan administration, specifically under a man named Oliver North. And if you Google his name, you'll see that Oliver North does have a very complicated history. He eventually will be tried for this because he organized the Iran-Contra affair. Although he doesn't serve time for it, he is sentenced to jail, but he's eventually pardoned and given probation. He's allowed to leave. He's in charge of the National Rifle Association now for some reason. He was made their president. I don't know why. But he designs a very ingenious scheme to support the Iran-Contras without violating the congressional funding mandates that forbid them from supporting the Contras. And this is at the heart of the Iran-Contra affair. And I'm going to show you the next slide, which is going to be a little confusing, so just bear with me. I'm going to take a drink. So what happens and what makes the Iran-Contra affair so complicated and in the American sense somewhat despicable from a purely chivalristic and honor aspect is our political negotiations with Iran and Iraq and Nicaragua. And virtually the United States is going to look very dirty in this, and for good reason. So what happens during the war is Iran senses that Iraq could potentially win this war. And Iran does not want to do that. So Iran contacts the United States hoping to reestablish friendly terms with them. Remember, it had only been a couple of years since the storming of the embassy in 1979 in Tehran. And Iran had hoped that they could reopen and renegotiate maybe terms for the release of any additional prisoners or the use of oil or trade between Iran and the United States in exchange for monies and guns and weapons to fight the Iraqis. The United States agrees, and they form an alliance with the Iranians. Now remember, the United States already has a secret alliance with the Iraqis, and they are giving the Iraqis guns and monies to fund themselves and support themselves, including chemical weapons to be used against the Iranians. The Iranians do not know this. The Iranians do not know that the United States is supporting Iraq, and Iraq does not know that the United States has entered into a secret agreement with the CIA to support Iran. So Iran gives the United States a large sum of money for guns and ammunition. But what the CIA does is they take a large chunk of that money. This is Iranian money, not American money, and they funnel it to the Contras in Nicaragua. And they do this by using contacts in Panama, namely military leaders in Panama and cocaine growers in Panama, to run money and guns into Nicaragua using Iranian money and using the same planes that were running the money and drugs or money and guns into Nicaragua to run cocaine back to Panama, which eventually found its way into the United States using CIA aircraft. The remainder of the Iranian money that was given to the United States, a fraction of it, about 20%, was handed over to the Israelis. And the Iranians and the Israelis, and the Iraqis for that matter, don't get along for a number of reasons, because they're this Jewish state that is displacing the Palestinians, among other things. The Israelis take the Iranian money and they use it to broker arms negotiations to buy arms and ship arms from Israel to Iran. But Iran doesn't know that its arms are coming from Israel. They think that the arms are coming from the United States. So Iran, technically, without realizing it, is funding the right-wing Contras and drug running, which is against against Islamic law. They are against drugs and alcohol. They're funding the right-wing Nicaraguan governments in South America using drug runners and gun runners back and forth between the CIA and the Panamanians, who are also using the remaining amount of money to go to the Israelis, to support the Israelis, which the Iranians don't like, and who take that money to ship it to Iran to use for guns, to use against the Iraqis, and the Iraqis who are being supported by the Americans. I know that sounded absolutely confusing. I'm going to give you a moment to think about that. Maybe pause it. I'm going to take another drink. This is a blot on American, the romanticization that Americans are trying to promote best interests in various regions of the world. And if you think this is bad, you should look at my Latin American lecture. Was quite would have made you feel very unclean. But nevertheless, this is part of the Cold War politics, and the United States, like the Soviet Union, is flexing its muscles to try and outdo the other in gaining power of any kind in these regions. The Iran-Contra affair is discovered by investigative journalists in Great Britain and the United States, and when the scandal is leaked and revealed, it absolutely infuriates the Iraqis and the Iranians, to say nothing of the Israelis, although the Israelis knew what was going on. The war between Iraq and Iran comes to a very swift end, as both realize that they have been fighting and being supported by the same side, and they realized more or less that they were being played against each other. And so the war ends after $2.5 billion worth of weapons were shipped via the Nicaraguans and the Americans and the Israelis to the Iranians and the Iraqis. And that pretty much caused both sides to call a truce. And they didn't like each other. Iran and Iraq were still very angry at each other, but they were so infuriated with the United States and the Western powers, including Israel at this time, that they withdrew. And over the course of the next final 2 years, from 88 to 89, they end hostilities and go into a negotiated, very tenuous, but negotiated peace. This more or less reinforces the Iranian belief that the United States is the devil and Satan of the world, and that you can't trust Israel and you can't trust these Western countries. Meanwhile, Iraq is very upset with the United States, but is willing to still somewhat play ball with them if the price is right. A very dark view of this was commented on by an Israeli official who said, quote, "We don't want this war to end ever, or to ever end." And this raises a lot of questions. And I want to pose this question to you to mull over and maybe put into your discussion board. Is what the United States and the Israelis and the French and the Nicaraguans, all of these players in the Iran-Contra affair, is what they did a form of genocide? By knowingly supplying chemical weapons and weapons to one side and secretly supplying the same weapons to the other side in order to fight themselves in what an Israeli official noted as a war that would never end. Just more and more people would keep killing each other until there were no more left to kill. Is this considered a form of genocide committed by, say, the United States or committed by the Israelis? I actually don't have a position on this one way or the other, but one could argue that is a very dark episode in American and Israeli history. But do we call it genocide? That is a very, very difficult question. I want you to think about that and maybe address it in your discussion boards. This is the longest slideshow of them all, except for maybe one of my Cold War slideshows. So bear with me. We will go through a very quick discussion of the first Gulf War, and then we will end with the war in Iraq. So we are beginning to wrap up this discussion. Saddam Hussein, as I mentioned before, was very upset with the United States, but was still very willing to play ball with the Americans if the price was right in the form of supplies, in the form of guns and ammunition, and in the form of access to wealth and power. Iraq's economy was damaged by the Iranian war, the Iraq-Iranian war, but it wasn't too terribly bad. But nevertheless, they were interested in consolidating power and consolidating and growing their economy in order to maintain their power in the Middle East. Iraq was the most powerful country in the Middle East at this time, maybe second only to Israel, but certainly you could put them on a par with each other. So Saddam Hussein targets the small principality of Kuwait, or the Kingdom of Kuwait, which has a lot of oil fields and has a lot of wealth and has access to the Persian Gulf. Saddam wants to invade the Arab Gulf states, these areas here along the southeast border, as he argues, because he's afraid that the Iranian Revolution will also invade these Arab Gulf states and cause Islamic revolution, which would be hostile to the Arab world, including its allies in the United States and Great Britain. So Saddam Hussein is arguing that Iraq is threatened by these radical Shias, and that Kuwait needs to be taken in order to form a military base of operation to defend oil fields and to defend the rest of these Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Yemen, so on and so forth from this Iranian revolution. He also was looking to improve his reputation as a great leader and conqueror. And so he invades Kuwait in August of 1990. And this is a rather muddled sort of invasion because in 1990, let me step back for a moment. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush, although he was not very close to Saddam, he had known him from his previous dealings with the Iran-Iraq War. And Iraq actually requested permission from the American government to invade Kuwait, asking if doing so would arouse the ire of the United States. And the United States essentially said that they had no interest in Kuwait. And so when Saddam invaded, he actually invaded with a small tacit blessing of the United States government. The United States government didn't give him a green light per se, but they didn't tell him no. And so he invaded Kuwait in 1990. The U.S., though, doesn't like Saddam Hussein's aggressive tactics, despite the fact that they were very well aware of them. And they want to protect their petroleum access in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia specifically. And so in 1990, they begin what's called Operation Desert Shield, which is a buildup of military equipment and supplies in Saudi Arabia. And this would lead eventually to Operation Desert Storm, which begins in January of 1991 with an aerial bombardment of key Iraqi military installations throughout the region, airfields, oil fields, and anti-aircraft fields. The ground war officially begins in February of 1991, and the ground war was only 100 hours long. After 100 hours, the Iraqi government was defeated by the United States Army. This is mainly due to the fact that although Iraq had a very large army and had decent aircraft, the American bombardment in January of 1991, which was done clandestinely and before there was never a declaration of war, it was simply just done before the resolution was handed down, the Iraqis really did not know the Americans were coming, and this hit them really as a blind side, and that pretty much destroyed any ability for the Iraq Air Force and the Iraq Army to defend itself against the United States. And so 100 hours was quite quick. Baghdad was never formally seized, but Saddam Hussein does capitulate and surrenders control to the United States. Saddam agrees to withdraw out of Kuwait. They're no longer allowed to have airplanes, but they can still have helicopters. They're not allowed. There's areas of Iraq they're not allowed to fly planes into anymore, and they have to reduce their weapon stockpiles and allow UN inspectors, the men pictured over here to the right, to go into Iraq and inspect military bases to ensure that no illegal weaponry is being created, such as chemical weapons or biological weapons, or nuclear weapons for that matter. And this mainly continues throughout the 1990s until 2003 with the War on Terror, or 2001, I should say, with the War on Terror. Throughout the better part of the 1990s, Saddam Hussein was under the thumb of the United States. But that's going to change after the September 11th attacks, when planes are flown into the buildings. And this is where it's going to get a little bit more confusing in how we actually get into Iraq in the first place, because it relies a lot on an information I shared with you today, specifically myths about Middle Eastern people, Muslim people, Iraqis, terrorists, so on and so forth. And what draws us into Iraq is going to be the false understanding that they were involved in the September 11th attacks. This belief that Saddam Hussein, who does hate America, and we did have a war with before, was somehow involved with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which is really not the case. So the reason why Saddam would not be involved with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Taliban are Afghans. Saddam is not Afghan. He does not care about the Afghans. He cares about Arabs. The Afghanis are not Arabs. Secondly, Saddam Hussein, while he is a Sunni Muslim, has no interest in religion, and he is decidedly secular. And he's going to promote a secular Arab country and a secular Arabist society. That is his goal. That is his desire. And therefore, he is not interested in the Islamic fanaticism of Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. There are no connections whatsoever between Iraq and the September 11th attacks here. But what happens is, when this happens, there is a lot of muddled hearsay. And although people in the government know better, and they don't necessarily take us into Iraq for those reasons, it gets convoluted in the media, convoluted in political elections, convoluted among different people who are ultra-patriotic at this one point. I remember this quite well. The belief that since Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, an evildoer, as they were called, a sponsor of state-sponsored terrorism, a bad man who hates America, who kills people, who shoots guns up in the air, a real bully, that he had to be involved, and that it was the United States mission to go after these people in Afghanistan, in part of Al-Qaeda, part of Iraq, part of Iran, part of North Korea, in what were called the Axis of Evil. And that's going to pull us into this war on terror in 2001 in Afghanistan, and a larger war on terror with the war on Iraq in 2003. So let's talk about that. The only reason why the United States is able to justify entering Iraq in 2003 comes because of a man named Curveball. Curveball is an Iraqi nationalist who escapes Iraq in late 1999, early 2000. And he claims to be a member of the Iraqi hierarchy, and specifically, he's a member of the Iraqi military R&D development industrial complex. He is a chemist who is in charge, he says, of making chemical and biological weapons. Curveball escapes to Germany, where he claims amnesty and requests amnesty, and claims to German intelligence officials that he has information that Americans, that Germans, that French and British really want to hear about. And this is the existence of mobile biological and chemical weapons laboratories that can be moved around and hidden from United Nations inspectors. And so despite the fact that the UN inspectors had been in Iraq since 1992, Curveball argued, that the inspectors were being hoodwinked, to use a modern term. They were being shown a facade of Iraq that was complying, but in fact was building up a very dangerous arsenal that it was planning to sell to terrorists. There was no proof of this whatsoever, and the Germans themselves were very, very skeptical. And the American intelligence agents were also skeptical themselves. But when they finally interviewed Curveball sometime just before the September 11th attacks, they were convinced that there was some truth to what he said, although they didn't entirely know how much. After the September 11th attacks, with the heightened sensitivity in this towards terrorism, towards national security, and the desire for America to avenge itself upon the world and attack terrorists and go after places where terrorists live, or places that harbor terrorists, there were politicians on the Hill not all of them, but a number of them, that heard about Curveball and used it to drum up support for an invasion of Iraq. And this comes to the most infamous point of this part of the lecture, outside of the Iran-Contra affair. In 2003, 2002, 2003, because the buildup for the invasion of Iraq begins in late 2002 and happens over the course of 2003 before the invasion takes place in August of 2003. The United States goes before the United Nations seeking a resolution to invade Iraq and a coalition to assist. The man who leads this speech before the United Nations is Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State under George W. Bush, and a very smart, very brilliant, and fascinating man in his own right. And he was famous, and you can find pictures of this online and video footage of it online, of showing these pictures of where these mobile laboratories, such as these cargo trucks with chemical and biological materials, cranes for loading it, more cargo trucks, assembly facilities were held. Now, these are satellite pictures, but there was never any proof that the things that Curveball told us were there were there. There was no proof. And the UN, the UN was highly skeptical that these materials even existed. But nevertheless, there was some interest. Even more infamously, the United States drummed up these absolutely brilliant models, both physical models and portraits like the ones here, that showed you what we believe these mobile biological and chemical weapons trucks looked like. These trucks would house chemical labs that could mix different types of gases together, like sarin gas and hydrochloride, nuclear fissionable material, create chemical or biological weapons. And these trucks would move together in coordinated efforts along highways, pull off to the side, and continue to mix these materials into weaponized materials that could be put on missiles or could be sprayed out by planes, so on and so forth. They were also rumored to be placed on trains as well and could be moved around the desert by trains. And there were even rumors that said that there were subway tunnels underneath Baghdad and around different cities in Baghdad that housed more of these biological weapons labs on board trains as well as trucks. So all of these pictures and things that I've showed you were shown before the United Nations to try to warrant support from the United Nations to get them to invade Iraq. But this did not work. The United Nations, specifically the French, opposed all invasions to Iraq, claiming that there was no evidence between a connection between Saddam Hussein and terrorists, specifically Al-Qaeda, and that there was no evidence that these trucks existed, or that these trains existed, or that these materials existed, and that the UN inspectors were doing a very good job. So the United States decided to take this information to the American public, as opposed to the United Nations, when the United Nations voted to not vote on this. So the Congress, the American Congress, takes it upon itself to go into Iraq on itself. And they issued the Iraqi resolution in 2002, which is not passed unanimously, but is passed by a significant majority of Congress, 297 yeas, 193 nays. It asserted that Iraq was not compliant with the 1991's weapons resolutions after the Gulf War, that they were interfering with the work of the inspectors, that they were committing genocide against the Kurds. Actually, that part was true. They were actually attacking the Kurds left and right and killing them in large numbers. That they were brutal against the Iraqis as a whole, and that's true as well. That they were involved with international terrorism, that was really not proven unless you count these two things as being terrorism, but certainly not international terrorism against the West. And they accused them of manufacturing of weapons of mass destruction, which was not proven. In March of 2003, the Americans crossed the border from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait into Iraq, and the rest, as we say, is history. Now, if you're old enough to remember, this is one of the more comical parts about the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq, which officially lasts between 2003 and 2004, although we've been there ever since, the French opposed us. The British went with us, but the French opposed us, and the Germans were leery as well. And we developed such anger to the French that the United States Congress passed a resolution, not a law, but a resolution that all of the food in the congressional cafeteria in the Capitol building, anything that had the word French in it would be renamed Freedom. So French toast was Freedom Toast, French fries were Freedom Fries, anything like that was renamed Freedom. Champagne was not called champagne, it was called, what was it? It was called, it had a weird name to it. I'm sorry, I can't remember. It wasn't called champagne anymore. It was called, a lot of people dumped champagne out, but the ones who kept it called it Liberty Wine. They called it Liberty Wine. I mean, this was absolutely ridiculous. This was stupid. I'm sorry to say this, but this was absolutely stupid. It was not an official thing, but private companies saw the opportunity to kind of get on board with what was left of our post 9/11 heightened nationalism. Even though the war in Iraq was very divisive, there were still a lot of people in support of it. And I still remember going to McDonald's and getting Freedom Fries. That's what they had. They had it on all the menus. You couldn't get French fries. They sold fries or Freedom Fries. And they wouldn't sell you French toast. They sold you Freedom Toast. And the French didn't even know what to make of this because the French didn't invent French toast. And they didn't invent French fries. Those were invented by the Belgians, and they became popular in the United States at Coney Island in New York. So this was just a very odd little episode in American history that kind of goes off of the war in Iraq. President George W. Bush concludes the war officially in 2004, calling it a mission accomplished. Unfortunately, that really didn't mean much. We didn't have Saddam Hussein for a while. He was hiding. We wouldn't get him until about a year later. And even then, Iraqi insurgencies continue to fight against us on behalf of the Ba'athist pro-Saddam party. And even after we managed to subdue the Ba'athist insurgency and subdue all of Saddam Hussein's supporters, that's when the more radical Islamic elements took over Iraq, coming in from the west, or coming in from the east via Iran, from Afghanistan. This would be Al-Qaeda, and then eventually the branches of Al-Qaeda that were partially destroyed reformed themselves into ISIS or ISIL. And Iraq now is completely divided and fully divided up among warlords, Sunni warlords who were formerly loyal to Saddam, who are now loyal to the United States, Iraqi security forces who were formerly members of the Ba'athist Party, who we were against in 2003 and 2004, but who actually turned out to be our best allies in the present day age. The Shia majority do run the government, but there's a lot of radicalism there, and they're being supported by Iran. And while they're not in league with ISIS, they don't mind working with ISIS, and ISIS have come over from Saudi Arabia to fight these Western insurgencies, and so on and so forth. Eventually causing the country to simply become what it is today. It's not a country anymore. It is a disputed territory in which there is no real centralized government anymore, and, well, it continues to be fought to this day. I don't really have anything else to say about Iraq. That really brings us to the conclusion of our discussion of Iran, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf Wars. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Prepare yourself for the final exam, and do conduct the discussion board and discuss America's involvement in the Middle East, and evaluate it in your own terms and tell me what you think.